Well, good morning, Golden Corner Church. Good morning to those of you who are visiting with us. I can say honestly, I can't tell you how glad I am to see you. Most of you know that I've been sick pretty much all year. I hadn't been to church all year. This is the first time I've been in church all year long. So I'm glad to be back, and I'm on the mend, and so is Lynn, and appreciate this opportunity to be here with you and to preach. I want to start a brand new sermon series this morning entitled Your Journey. The Bible teaches that life is a journey. And I remember the first time that thought occurred to me. Boy, I'm about to date myself in a big, big way. But when your beard is snow white, look, man, there's no way of hiding it. I'm old, I get it. It was a Saturday morning in 1978. And I had the rare Saturday off. And I was in the floor playing with my little girl, Amy, when this question shot into my mind out of nowhere. If Amy follows you down the path you've chosen, where will it take her? Now that question was vivid. So vivid, I couldn't ignore it. I just kind of stopped everything I was doing. And at that point, I was not a Christian. As a matter of fact, I was about as far from God as a person could get. But there was something about that question that led me to believe that God had just spoken to me. I want you to think about the first part of that question. If Amy follows you down the path you've chosen. I'd never really thought about it until that moment. I was on a path that I had chosen. My life had direction. I was going somewhere. I was on a journey, Paul. I was on a journey. And so are each of you. You're a pilgrim on a journey called life. And this morning, I have a question for you. How would you describe your journey? I'm going to give you three options, okay? Option number one, running from God. Does that sound like you? Sound like your journey? Option number two, returning to God. Option number three, walking with God. You say, is that it? Those are the only options? I believe those are the only three options we have. I believe that everyone in this room could describe their journey one of those three ways. We're either running from God, or we're on our way back to God, or we're walking with God. So at this point in your life, how would you describe your journey? You wouldn't be running from God, would you? Is your journey actually leading you further and further away from God? You say, Ronnie, what would that look like? Man, I'm glad you asked that question. Because I want to tell you a story I found in the Bible that illustrates what it looks like to run from God. Now, I find this story in the New Testament book of Philemon. And at that point, you should say, what? I mean, what is that? Philemon? I got Matthew, I got John, I got Revelation. What is this Philemon thing? Well, if you look in the New Testament, in between the book of Titus and Hebrews, and you say, dude, I'm still lost. But in between the books of Titus and Hebrews, you find this little book called Philemon. So if you're in the New Testament, you go 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, Titus, Philemon. Philemon is one of the shortest books in the Bible. One chapter. 25 verses. The book itself is a letter written by a man named Paul while he was in prison in Rome. And he was in prison not for not paying his speeding tickets or something like that. He was in prison because he'd been arrested for teaching and preaching about Jesus. And while he's in the prison, he wrote this letter. He didn't just write it on a whim and say to himself, man, this would be a good idea. Maybe I ought to say this. No, God laid it on his heart and then gave him every word. It was to be penciled down on this letter exactly as it should be said, because this letter was going to be a part of the Bible, the eternal Word of God. Can you imagine that? Now, he wrote the book to a guy named Philemon. Now, I got to tell you a little bit about him, and I know that we're kind of in some details here. We'll emerge from this, but you got to know these details for this to make any sense. Let me tell you what he was like. He was well-to-do. He was a man of substantial means. He had his own place, his own house. His house was probably larger than most of his neighbors. He was married. His wife's name was Aphia. What a gorgeous name. Why don't we still use that name when we're naming our daughters? Aphia. He had at least one son, and his name was Archippus. And yeah, I get why that one's not on our list of names anymore. They lived in the city of Colossae. Philemon had slaves. He had at least one male slave, and his name was Onesimus. Now, there had to be a point in time where Philemon visited the neighboring city of Ephesus. And for 3 years in the city of Ephesus, Paul, the same one writing the letter, who's now in prison, had taught and preached about Jesus. 3 solid years. Philemon obviously had made his way over there, heard this teaching, chose to accept Christ, and Philemon was saved. Man, I'm talking about gloriously, powerfully transformed. He was a new man. The Bible says Philemon had an incredible faith in God and an incredible love for God, and he loved people. You know this thing that we aspire, we want to love God and love people? He had this thing going on. And the Bible tells us that that he was very others-oriented. He thought a lot about God. He thought a lot about the people around him. Thought very little of himself. He had an outreach inclination. He was constantly looking for ways to show the love of God to people and help people find Christ. His wife, Aphia, was saved as well. She became a very devoted believer. Now listen, these weren't nominal church attenders. These were hardcore followers of Christ. His wife was very influential in the church at Colossae. His son, Archippus, apparently was converted, and he probably spent some time working on the staff of the church at Colossae, and at this point in time was probably serving as senior pastor. So it was a family deal. And the church, you know where the church met? They met in Philemon's house. That's got to be a pretty big spread. You know what I'm saying? So the church would meet in his house. Now in this house there was this slave named Onesimus. Now his name was deceiving. His name means useful. But the Bible is very clear, as a slave, he was pretty doggone useless. I imagine that during the course of the day, he was often on Facebook, checking up, scrolling, getting the news feeds. I think he probably spent a lot of time texting friends and maybe watching YouTube videos and going to the other slaves and going, have you seen this one? Have you seen this crazy? I believe he's the kind of slave that rarely finished a project. If he did, it wasn't on time and it wasn't done right. And as a slave, he was just pretty useless. And guys, I'm getting all this from the book of Philemon, and we're not going to read it today. I'm kind of setting the stage. We're going to start reading next week, but pretty worthless. The Bible said there came a day where Onesimus wronged Philemon. You see, what did he do? Robbed him. Stole from him. He took money. Listen, he may have taken something of great value and taken it to the pawn shop the next day and turned it into money, or he may have just found Philemon's stash and he took the money. Having wronged his master and robbed from him, he now makes a decision, I got to get out of town. I got to get away from my master. Why? The law is on his side. And according to the law, he can punish me severely. He could even take my life, and there's nothing I could do. So he ran. You know where he went? He went all the way from Colossae to Rome. You know how far that is? 1,200 miles. 1,200 miles. It probably took him months. Why Rome? Because Rome was one of the largest cities on the planet at that time, if not the largest. And I believe, and it was a mecca for runaway slaves. And I believe he's thinking this: in a sea of people, I can just get lost and just be a nameless face in the crowd. Onesimus wronged his master. What did he do? He ran from him. He chose to put as much distance between himself and his master as he could. And I think this is typical human behavior. When we do somebody wrong, our tendency is to avoid them. And I think we do the same thing with God. When we do God wrong, our first instinct may be to run away from Him. I'll give you an example. Old Testament book of Genesis. God created the earth. He created Adam and Eve. He put them in the middle of this fabulous garden called Eden. And He told Adam and Eve, here's the deal. You know, I've got fruit trees all over this place. There are vegetables coming up, and all of it is yours. Eat as much as you want whenever you want, except for this one tree called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Don't eat that fruit. You know the story, don't you? You know what they did. They wronged God. And in spite of the fact that He told them, don't do that, they did it anyway. Now, when Adam and Eve were in this garden, the Bible said God would come down every morning, evening, and they would fellowship together. They would hang out. God would come down, they'd walk around, they had talk, they enjoyed each other's company. Well, after they wronged God, when God showed up to have His visit with them, you know what they did? If you know the story, you know what they did. What'd they do? They ran from Him. And they hid themselves from Him. At that moment, I believe this became typical human behavior. Whenever we wrong God, our instinct is to distance ourselves from Him. We've got to run away. Why do we do that? Perhaps we run because we're afraid. I believe that Onesimus was running from Philemon because he was afraid. He knew the law's on his side. He can do whatever he wants to me. He can punish me any way he wants, up to taking my life. And I believe that he was running from this man because he was afraid. And sometimes I think we do God wrong and we take off running, trying to get as much distance as we can from God because we fear His retribution. Let me tell you how narrow-minded or maybe simple-minded we human beings are. We think that if we run from God, somehow or another we can escape the consequences of our wrongdoing. I think sometimes we run from God out of shame. I think that's what Adam and Eve did. They were ashamed of what they had done, and they didn't want to face God. I think sometimes we run from God out of really just a sense of rebellion. We don't want God to be our master. We don't want to answer to Him or anyone else. We have a lifestyle that we've chosen, and it's not the lifestyle that God has chosen for us, so we choose to run away from Him. I think a good example of that is found in the New Testament story of the prodigal son. Would y'all excuse me while I wipe my nose? You want to talk about something that's uncomfortable and awkward? Is when you got to blow your nose or wipe your nose in a crowd like this with cameras on you and it projected up on a screen behind you. You know it? But I've had the flu, and it's one of those things I got to do. How'd you like that for a little poem? Now back to my original question. At this point in your life, how would you describe your journey? Are you running away from God? I've been pastoring 30 years, and this is the way I often see this go down. I see it happen to a lot of young men and women. They were raised in a Christian household. They went to church all their lives, but when they got the first taste of freedom, maybe they graduated from high school and moved off to college, one of the first things they do is they stop attending church. They cut ties with all their Christian influences, and they put God in the rearview mirror. I want to go in a different direction. I can't tell you how many times as a pastor I've witnessed people who were apparently on their way back to God. You could just kind of sense they're finally moving in the right direction, but for some reason they just stop and they slowly turn and then run hard in the opposite direction. Now, they've got excuses and they've got explanations as to what's going on in life, but the truth is they made a conscious decision not to go any further, but rather than do that, I'm going to run away from God. I've often watched men and women come to a crossroads in their life where they had a decision, sin or God, and they choose sin. and that sin acts as a lure, luring them onto a pathway that actually leads them far away from God and everything that He ever planned for them. So what about you? How would you describe your journey? Are you running from God? If so, there's something you got to know. And you need to know it today. You ready? You can't outrun God. You can't outrun Him. Why do you think Onesimus actually ran from Philemon? You say, well, you just told us. He wronged him and robbed from him. Okay, let me rephrase the question. Why did he wrong him and rob from him? I got a theory. It's just a theory. This is, at this point, you can categorize my next statements as Hodgeology, okay? But I get my theory really from what I read in this book from the Bible. I don't think Onesimus was running from Philemon as much as he was running from God. You say, explain that. Think about this. Here's Onesimus. His master is Philemon, and his master is a devoted Christian man with an others orientation and an outreach inclination. Think about this. Do you think that Philemon never prayed for Onesimus? Don't you think that this man who was known for the way he loved people, don't you think he cared about Onesimus? If he's this dynamic, devoted believer who's trying to help others come to Christ, don't you think he would try to lead his own slave to Christ? Well, of course he would. I promise you that Philemon was praying for this man, that he was loving on this man, and that at times he shared with him. Let me tell you my testimony. Let me tell you about this Jesus. You know, man, Onesimus, I'd love to see you experience what I'm experiencing. I know he did that. What about Aphia? She's a devoted, influential Christian. You think she wasn't doing the same thing? What about Archippus? He's not only devoted, he's the pastor. And then you got these three Christians who are trying to influence. I'm sure they were trying to influence Onesimus come to Christ. And when you know at the very house where Onesimus worked, that's where the church met. And so, you know, on a regular basis, here come all those Christians. And they're singing their songs and they're preaching their sermons and they're encouraging one another and here's Onesimus stuck in the middle of that. It's coming from every direction. Here's what I believe. I believe God started working on Onesimus. I believe He started dealing with him. You know what I mean by that? For those of you who have been saved, you went through this where all of a sudden it's like a light goes on. You start, I guess you could say, you start feeling God draw you. You start hearing Him talk to you. He's kind of like, you know, I want the best for you. I want you to make things right with me. You know, things are out of place. Do you remember what that was like? Do you remember how that felt? Can I tell you? I remember how it felt for me. It scared me because I knew if I do what He wants, big change is coming. And how do we human beings respond to change? It scares us. And I remember when God began to deal with me, man, it kind of frightening. And it also made me uncomfortable because God would talk to me about my sins and He would talk to me about my guilt and He would talk to me about where this is all taking me and there's a way to escape this. Who wants to be told that you're guilty of sin and in jeopardy of dying and going to hell? That's not a comfortable conversation, but it's one God had with me multiple times when He was dealing with me. And I believe this started to happen to Onesimus. I believe he was frightened at the prospect of change, and he was awfully uncomfortable about being talked to about his sins and eternity and all this. And I believe that he thought to himself, I got to get out of here. I got to get away from these Christian people. I got to get away from this church. I got to get away from this Jesus they're talking about. I got to get away from this nagging, haunting feeling that's come over me. I got to get out of here. I'm running, man. I'm running. And exactly how are you going to finance that, Onesimus? You're a slave and you got nothing. I know where the boss keeps his stash. I bought myself a fistful of bills, and he used it to make his way to Rome. I believe he was trying to get away from the God who was dealing with him. Now, he goes to Rome, sea of people. Somewhere in that sea, there's a man named Paul, right? He's in prison. What are the odds that Onesimus is going to encounter Paul when he gets to Rome? I can tell you, slim to none. Guess what happened? He walked straight into Paul. I don't know how this happened. I think it probably went down like this. I think he probably got him a job with the prison system. And his job required some type of consistent contact with multiple prisoners. And one of the prisoners he had to tend to was a guy named Paul, the very man that led his master to Christ. Now, I do know this for a fact. You know what Paul started doing? Praying for him. You know what Paul started doing? Loving him. You know what Paul started doing? Witnessing to him. I want to tell you what Jesus has done for me. Let me tell you what he's done for you. And I believe, you know what Paul started doing? Encouraging, accept Christ. And you know what happened? God started dealing with him in Rome just like he'd been dealing with him in Colossae. He found himself in the identical situation. Listen to this. I believe Onesimus traveled 1,200 miles, crossed rivers, mountain ranges, and seas in the hope of escaping God, only to run into the very God he was running from. You can't outrun God. Man, I've seen this happen so many times. You kind of see somebody enter into this process. You know that God's dealing with them. You know God's talking with them. You know God's drawing them. And they do too. And it frightens them. The prospect of change, it makes them uncomfortable thinking about things like sin and eternity. So they decide to make a break for it. They believe they can make it all go away by running from God. They wouldn't darken the doors of a church. They would never open the Bible and read it. They're not going to spend any time with real Christian people. They surround themselves with anyone or anything that is anti-God. They may go deeper and deeper into a sinful lifestyle, hoping they can escape God, His voice, and His work. And maybe that's exactly what you're doing. If so, I'm here to alert you to something. You can't outrun God. Cross an ocean, and God will be there, patiently waiting on you. Move to a new town, change your address. It won't be long, and God will show up at your front door. Isolate yourself out in the wilderness, and guess what you're going to discover? You're not alone there either. He's out there. Numb yourself with alcohol or drugs. Sober up, guess what? He's still there. Still working. Still talking. So here's what I'm suggesting. If you can't outrun God, stop running from Him and start running to Him. Change the direction of your journey. Now, I know what some of you just thought. It's too late, Ronnie, too late for me. You don't know how long I've been running. You don't know how far I am from God. You're right. There's so much I don't know, but I do know this. Do you believe God still speaks to people? Do you believe He could speak to me and give me a word to share with you? Because I believe He did, and this is the word I believe He sent me to give to you. You haven't gone so far that you can't get back. You haven't gone so far that you can't get back. No matter how far you've gone, there's always a way back to God. There's always a way back to Him because God made a way for runaways to return to Him. Every day lived as a fugitive from God is a wasted day. So why don't you stop running from Him and start running to Him? You say, how, Ronnie? How do I get back to God? Well, I'm probably going to have to really blow my nose a lot here in the next few seconds. On a Saturday morning in 1978, God asked me a question. If Amy follows you down the path that you've chosen, where will it take her? I I was never the same. Never. That day marked the turning point of my life. Recognizing that my life was a journey forced me to look ahead and realize the path I was on was not taking me where I wanted to go. I was going in the wrong direction, and whether or not I liked it, others were following me. The people I loved the most were following me. It was sobering. If there was a way back to God, I intended to find it. So, guess what I started doing? It's crazy. I started reading the Bible. I had people I worked with that I knew went to church, and I assumed they were Christians. And I remember this one sweet little lady, her name was Bit. And I would go to Bit. I trusted her, and I'd say, Bit, what does a person got to do to make things right with God? Do you really believe in hell? What's Jesus got to do with it? I mean, I had dozens and dozens of questions for Bit. Boy, she would faithfully give me the answers the best she could. I started going to church and listening to sermons. And here's what I learned. There's a way back to God. With a little help and a little faith, anyone could get back to God, even a guy like me. On a Saturday in 1978, the direction of my journey changed. I stopped running from God and started making my way back to Him. My journey led me to a little old country church between Salem and Walhalla called Flat Shoals Baptist Church. And there on a Sunday morning, January 21st, 1979. Did you catch that date? January 21st, 1979. What's today's date? Today's my 39th birthday. Huh? I asked Jared Lauer this morning, do you remember what you did 39 years ago? He said, Ronnie, I'm 37. I said, okay. But I remember what I did 39 years ago. 39 years ago, I was so sick of running. I got up and went to my closet. I picked out the best set of work clothes that I only owned work clothes. I picked out the best set I had. And I put them on. I looked at Lynn and I said, will you go to church with me? And she said, no. I went. I was a man on a mission. I'd been closing in hard on God for months. I knew I'm just a step or two away. I prayed a prayer and I said, God, if you'll let me live to get in that church building, I'll settle this today. Oh, He let me live. I walked in the church. I sat on the right side, the back pew, right on the aisle. I was kind of a jerk. People would come in and they'd look at me like, slide down. And I'd go, I'd step out and say, you go in here. Because I knew this. Before this service is over, I'm getting up. I got a few more steps to take. About the length of that aisle, from this pew to that altar. And before this day's out, I'm taking those steps. Preacher preached. He said, I want everybody to bow their heads and close their eyes. And, he said, I didn't even let him finish his spiel. I stood up. I started in his direction. I could tell he was kind of confused. Like, come on, man, I haven't even made my big talk here. 39 years ago, about right now, I walked the aisle at the conclusion of that service and took my final steps back to God. I made it back to Him, and if I can, you can. And if you'll come back next week, I'll make you this promise. I'll show you the way back. I'll show you the way back. I'm going to ask that everybody bow their heads and close their eyes. We're going to close in a word of prayer. Here's what I want to say. You may be sitting here this morning going, whoa, 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 I'm not waiting till next week. Ronnie, I don't know if I'll be alive next week. What about me? The fact that I'm sitting here is evidence that this has been on my mind. I'll tell you what I'll do. I got nowhere I need to be. I'm going to close this service out. When we come back next week, I'll tell the whole group how to get back. But if you don't want to wait until then, I'll hang around the rest of this day. And we'll take care of it today, if that's what you want. Father, my heart is just filled with joy over the fact that you welcome runaways back. I'm so grateful that you pursue runaways. No matter where we thought we could be and lose you somewhere, that you were there patiently waiting on us, ready to take us back. Thank you. I know this morning, Lord, I'm speaking to someone whose journey is not taking them in the right direction. You make them aware. You deal with them the way you dealt with me. I pray they'll come back to you. And if today's the day, as I said, Lord, then so be it. I'll be here. And in the name of Jesus, we pray together. Amen. Thank you for being here. Listen, if you need to talk to me, like I said, I'll be here. You're dismissed.